Our scripture this morning comes from Isaiah chapter 46. I'll be reading verses 8 through 11. Remember this and consider. Recall it to mind, you transgressors. Remember the former things of old. For I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is no one like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things not yet done, saying, my purpose shall stand, and I will fulfill my intention, calling a bird of prey from the east, the man for my purpose from a far country. I have spoken, and I will bring it to pass. I have planned, and I will do it. This is the word of the Lord. If someone has promised you something, how do you know that they will keep that promise? If you think about it, we hear promises all the time. Companies are trained in how to write good, catchy promises, and you probably know some of them by heart. 15 minutes or less can save you. Okay, no, there's just a few of us here this morning. We have to get a little bit better than this. All right, but you guys know it. You know the words of this, right? If you watched the Super Bowl last week, you heard promises every few minutes on commercial breaks. In fact, over the course of the game, they played over 50 minutes of commercials. 50 minutes of overt promises and subtle ones. Companies that paid millions of dollars to promise you happiness and health and security. But the thing is, most of us, I think, have lived long enough to know that Cheez-Its aren't going to satisfy our every craving. A case of Bud Light is not actually going to attract the entire block to your barbecue. And perfume doesn't actually transpose you to a kind of weird alternate reality. And I think the sheer amount of promises that we're inundated with day in and day out actually lessens the force of those promises. Promises en masse feel cheap. This month, Stephen Rodriguez and I have been working our way through the promises of God in the book of Isaiah. They're beautiful promises, timeless promises. They're the kind of promises that the Christian community tends to embroider and hang on walls, or cricket onto t-shirts and pillows and coffee mugs. And I think if we're totally honest, sometimes we get just as burnt out on those promises as we are on commercials. Because most of us have, likewise, lived long enough to know that things don't always work out the way that we want them to. And sometimes we look at the events in our own lives and at the world around us and we think, that's cute on a pillow, but where is this promise-keeping God now? Here, in this. Throughout this series on Isaiah, we've talked about the nation of Israel in exile, their temple in ruins. And as they heard these promises, they would have been asking these same questions. Where was this promise-keeping God here in this? How could they know that God would actually keep these promises that he was making to them? Well, our passage today speaks to exactly that question, to the trustworthiness of the God who was making these promises, the God who had covenanted with them. That they, and likewise we, can indeed trust God to keep his promises is founded upon two principles that we see here in Isaiah 46. That God's might cannot be matched, and God's plan cannot be thwarted. And that will serve as our general outline this morning. That God's might cannot be matched, and God's plan cannot be thwarted. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about the clashing of myths. And we talked about Babylon's myths and Israel's myths, the competing ideologies of the people of God and the people of Babylon. We talked about the triumphal parade of their gods through the streets and God's scathing criticism that these gods were in fact powerless to save. God's declaration to them was this, and I'm paraphrasing here. He said, "You do not serve puppet gods, you serve the one true God. You do not serve a God that you must carry. You serve a God who carries you. You do not serve a God who cannot save. You serve a God who will save." If we pick up in verse 5 of chapter 46, we read this. To whom will you liken me and make me equal, and compare me as though we are alike? Those who lavish gold from the purse and weigh out silver in the scales, they hire a goldsmith who makes it into a god, and then they fall down and they worship. They lift it to their shoulders, they carry it, they set it in its place, and it stands there. It cannot move from its place. If one cries out to it, it does not answer or save anyone from trouble. Remember this and consider. Recall it to mind, you transgressors. Remember the former things of old. For I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is no one like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things not yet done, saying, my purpose shall stand. If we were to sum up this part of the passage in a single phrase, it would be, God's might cannot be matched. And we hear the same declaration of God's might in the last half of Isaiah chapter 40, beginning in verse 25. To whom then will you compare me, and who is my equal, says the Holy One. Why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, and my right is disregarded by my God? Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not grow faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. Throughout the book of Isaiah, we are faced time and time again with this high view of the sovereignty of God, a God who is wholly other, who transcends all earthly powers and wisdom, a God whose might cannot be matched. But this transcendence does not indicate a God who is above and outside of the problems that we're facing. As Alec Matier writes in his commentary, the wrong inference from God's transcendence is that he is too great to care. The right one is that he is too great to fail. The wrong inference from God's transcendence is that he is too great to care. The right one is that he is too great to fail. And this right here, I think, is so crucial as we're looking at these promises here in the book of Isaiah. Matier goes on to write that the assertion of the glory of God, the Creator, is applied in Isaiah as a cure for the despondent heart that cries, how can God do this to me? He no longer remembers or cares. And the solution to this question is first and foremost theology, in the form of a reiteration of the doctrine of God. Do you not know? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of heaven and earth. God's might cannot be matched. But this is not the might of a God who distances himself from us. This is a mighty God who stoops toward us, who draws close to us, who promised to never leave us or forsake us, who, as Stephen beautifully illustrated last week, carries us as a shepherd carries a lamb. The wrong inference from God's transcendence here in Isaiah is that he is too great to care. The right one is that he is too great to fail. God's might provides for us a foundation upon which to stand, a foundation upon which to plant these promises that he's giving us. How can we know that God will keep his promises? Because God's might cannot be matched, and because God's plan cannot be thwarted. Over Christmas break, we took our kids to go see Moana 2 in the theater. And if you aren't familiar with the story, Moana lives on an island with her people, and they used to be explorers. In the first movie, you find out that they've been living kind of this sheltered life on their island, tucked in behind this protective barrier, afraid to go beyond it. And this was part of what was protecting their island and protecting the people. But in order to save her island from something that happens, Moana must go beyond that barrier, out into the unknown. And along the way, she meets a rather self-absorbed demigod named Maui, who helps her on this quest. And movie 2 is essentially the same thing, all over again. This time, the stakes are even higher. and she must fight yet another god with evil intentions, and so she sets off with this motley crew, including a deranged rooster that somehow never dies, and a tiny fat pink pig that no one ever eats, regardless of how hungry they get. And off they go to save the world. Now, I don't want to give any spoilers because I know that with my introduction to the movie this morning, you probably all are just dying to see it. But partway through the movie, there's this scene where Moana washes up on the shore of an island somewhere in the middle of the ocean. And her ship is in tatters, and her plans have all been foiled, and she's just utterly and completely defeated. And when Maui comes to talk to her, she declares in utter frustration. She says this, "Every time I think I know what I am supposed to do, everything changes." And I sat in that theater, and I just cried. And my first thought was, oh my gosh, I'm turning into my mother. If I start watching Hallmark movies, you all need to stage an intervention, stat, pronto. But there I was, mopping the tears off of my face while my kids and all the other kids in this packed theater are like shoving popcorn into theirs. Every time I think I know what I am supposed to do, everything changes. Man, I felt that line to the very core of my being for so many reasons. And my guess is that most of you have felt that at times too. Maybe like me, you feel it now. This period for God's people is one that's marked by constant change. The Egyptians and then the Assyrians lose the battle of power to the Babylonians, and now Persia enters the scene as a new world power. In our passage today, most scholars think that the bird of prey mentioned is Cyrus. And the name Cyrus probably sounds familiar. Cyrus is the Persian king mentioned in 2 Chronicles who permits God's people to go back and to rebuild their temple. Interestingly, a lot of the study on this passage focuses in here on this line, on Cyrus. Why is he called a bird of prey? What does it mean that God is using him? Is Cyrus a benevolent ruler? Is he a Messiah figure? Or is this just a move that gives him a particular political advantage? We are utterly fascinated by this piece of the story, by these two little lines in the middle of this passage. But I think that focusing on Cyrus here is exactly the wrong thing to do. It's fascinating, and it's interesting, and it's compelling, and it is a distraction. Gordon McConville has it exactly right in his commentary when he writes that even as the spotlight falls brightly on Cyrus here, the real emphasis continues to be much more on the nature and the actions of Yahweh. And I think there's a real danger here in our exegesis and interpretation of this passage to do exactly what Israel is being told not to do, and to make an idol out of this Persian ruler. And I've seen a lot of exegesis and a lot of application on this passage that makes the entire thing boil down to, if God can use Cyrus, he can use fill in the blank. But my message title this morning is actually a bit of a bait and switch, because the point of this passage isn't Cyrus. The point is that God's plan cannot be thwarted, that God can and will bring about what he has purposed, even if it requires putting it in the heart of a Persian ruler, who, by the way, is fully committed to the god Marduk, to allow the people to rebuild the temple. I have spoken, and I will bring it to pass, God says. I have planned, and I will do it. And I think this point in our passage is probably the hardest one to parse out. It's a point that we tend to kind of slap like a Band-Aid over top of gaping wounds, hoping that it'll fix it, attempting to smooth over what we don't quite know what to do with. This emphasis on a God whose purpose will prevail tends to be, in the words of New York Times columnist and author Kate Bowler, everything happens for a reason. We want to zero in here, I think, on Cyrus as a means of making sense of Israel's story, so that we can say, see, this is what God is doing here. But the truth is, even in the Cyrus storyline, we don't find the kind of neat, tidy story that we might expect, or that we might hope to see. Yes, God's people are allowed to go back and return and rebuild the temple, but the years following that return are volatile ones. That temple is also ransacked. And I think in all of this, we have to resist the urge to try and fit the story of the people of God into some sort of neatly mapped out timeline in which every single thing works out and makes perfect sense. Because in so many ways, it doesn't make sense. And to write a neat, tidy story over top of it is to minimize the pain and the wrestling and the struggle and the questions of the people of Israel and their God. This emphasis on God's purpose here is not to place everything they will experience like a cog in the wheel of God's ongoing plan, but rather to give them a foundation upon which to stand. What God has spoken, God will bring to pass. What God has planned, God will do. We can trust him to keep his promises. Now, why does all of this matter? Why go to such great lengths to emphasize God's matchless might and draw the people's attention to the fact that God's purpose cannot be thwarted? Well, frankly, because promises en masse feel cheap. And the irony in all of this is that God, too, has given his people many, many promises. Promises that would have felt to a people in exile totally disconnected from the reality that they were facing. And for these promises, these beautiful promises here in the book of Isaiah, to be anything other than a bunch of sentimental platitudes, they had to be tethered, not to their present circumstances, and most definitely not to a Persian king, but to the character and the nature of Yahweh. Isaiah contains some of the most incredible promises, beautiful promises, lofty promises, promises about peace with the nations flooding to Zion, promises about hope and about redemption, promises about a God who will carry them, who has always carried them, who will always carry them. And as these promises rang out in striking dissonance in the midst of the circumstances that they were facing, God knew that Israel needed to be reminded of the nature and the character of the one who was making those promises. These were not empty promises and cheap platitudes. This was the word of the living God, the same God who covenanted with Abraham, who led his people out of bondage and slavery in Egypt, whose presence went with them by cloud and by fire, who provided water and manna in the wilderness, a God who had not abandoned them, even in exile, but spoke to them through the prophets these words of hope and of peace. Do you not know? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. When we first moved back to Rochester a number of years ago, we lived in the student housing at University of Rochester. And we were in a townhouse surrounded by other townhouses, and in the middle of all of these houses was a courtyard with a little playground in it, which was great for us with our kids. Just send them out the back door and let them go. And Lawrence, who was our youngest, was very, very little at the time, but he was determined to keep up with all of these older neighborhood kids. And so he learned really early on, how to climb to the top of that playground. The only problem was, once he got himself up there, he didn't know how to get back down. He didn't like the slide, and when you're that little, the idea of like scooting backwards and like sending your legs off the back to try and go down the ladder backwards is just you're not coordinated enough, and it's terrifying. So what he would do is he'd climb up there, and then he would get stuck. And all the other kids would leave the playground, and he would just be standing up there stuck, unable to get down, and not liking any of the options that were available to him. And so for a good portion of that summer, to try and attempt to avoid having to climb up and then like shimmy my way back down the ladder with him, holding him in one of my arms, I tried to convince him to just jump off the top of that platform into my arms. And so I would stand near the playground, and I would hold out my arms, and I would say, just jump, I'll catch you. And he'd edge a little closer, and he'd kind of like grab onto the sides of it, and he'd look down at me, and then he'd look down at the ground, and he would look back up at me, and I could just, you could just see the decision-making happening on his face. Do I want to jump off the top of this thing? And I could see this battle taking place between my words and his fear. Uncertainty written all over his face as we did this, as he peered down at me and looked at the ground and then looked at my outstretched arms. And he would think about it for a minute, and then he would take a step back, and his little chin would get all quivery, and he'd say, I can't. So I'd climb up, and I'd get him again and bring him back down. And we did this for weeks at a time. He would call me back over to the playground time and time again, insisting that he wanted to jump this time. And so I'd hold out my arms, and I would say, just do it, just jump. Mommy will catch you, I promise. And he would look at me, and he would look at the ground, and he would look back up at me, and he would take a step back and go, nope, not going to happen. And we did this for weeks and weeks. And then one day, sheer terror written all over his little face, he did it. He jumped, leapt right off the top of that thing, and I caught him. And as I swung him around and set him down, he let out this nervous little giggle, and then he looked up at me and he shouted, again! I don't know how many times I caught him that day, and dozens. It was dozens. He just leapt off, kept leaping. That day, the next day, the day after that, suddenly this was all that he wanted to do. In fact, he became so confident in my ability to catch him that he started climbing to the top of anything that he could climb. Oh, you know where this is going, because you all know Lawrence. So he would climb to the top of anything he would climb, and then he would just throw his arms out wide, and he would holler, Mommy, catch you! And then he would just leap into the unknown. I didn't even have to be anywhere near him for him to do this. He just would leap, and a look of utter glee on his face as I scrambled to try and get there in time from wherever I was. Honestly, it is a miracle the kid is still with us today. Yeah, it was crazy. And it got even worse when someone gave him a Batman suit. It was just like game over. Game over. I regretted this decision from that very moment. But for these promises, these beautiful, beautiful promises here in the book of Isaiah, to be anything other than a bunch of sentimental platitudes, for you and for me, they have to be tethered not to our present circumstances, but to the character and the nature of Yahweh. Things are not always going to work out the way that we expect. There are going to be ups and downs and twists and turns. There are going to be excruciatingly hard things that we face, excruciatingly hard things in the world around us, and times when we don't know what to do. But we do know the character and the nature of the one whose arms are there to catch us, the one who carries us like a shepherd carries a lamb, a God whose might cannot be matched and whose purpose cannot be thwarted. No matter what you're facing today, and no matter what you'll face tomorrow, these promises in the book of Isaiah are not empty promises and cheap platitudes, but the word of the living God. The God who covenanted with Abraham, who led his people out of bondage and slavery in Egypt, whose presence went with them by cloud and by fire, who provided water and manna in the wilderness. A God who did not abandon them, even in exile, but spoke to them through the prophets words of hope and of promise. And a God who did the most outrageous, unexpected thing possible, taking on human flesh to come and to walk among us, to experience life with us, to teach us and to serve us. A God who bore upon himself the weight of our sin and our shame, taking to that cross a burden that was not his to bear. It was ours, and he carried it for us, dying for us that we might truly be free. The promises of God here in the book of Isaiah might ring out in striking dissonance in the midst of whatever it is that you're facing, but they are not cheap promises. They are not empty platitudes. They are the words of the living God who can be trusted to keep his promises. Let's pray. Mighty God, I'll be the first to admit that sometimes I hear your promises and I can feel the skepticism rising in my own heart. I feel the dissonance between the hope and the promise in your word and the darkness and the pain in this world we inhabit. And I just cannot make it all make sense. I have wrestled with your word, and I have wrestled with this word. And yet you've asked us to trust you, not because everything will ultimately make sense, but because you are good. Because yours are the arms that stand ready to catch us. Yours are the arms that carry us. Arms that bore your people through the exodus and the wilderness and the exile. Arms that took on flesh, that welcomed children to come, that reached out to heal and to serve the poor, the least, and the broken. Arms that were nailed to a cross for us. God, help us to know, to believe right down to our very bones that what you have promised, you will do. No matter what we face today, and no matter what comes tomorrow, may we rest in the knowledge that you are indeed a God who can be trusted to keep your promises. Amen.